Great. So reading through some of Wang's predictions, do you think the situation in Loudoun County, Virginia is actually a feature and not necessarily a bug of the failings of liberalism as we know it, which teaches licentiousness over liberty as classically conceived by our founding fathers?
I think so. And I think that it's very important to look at the situation that's going on in China right now and compare it to the situation we find ourselves in the United States, because in some ways they're experiencing on a slightly slowed down clock the same thing that's happened in the United States. Think back to the time that a lot of Americans love to think about, the 1990s in the United States. Everything was perfect. It was a utopia. There's a lot of millennial nostalgia for that time. But in reality, it was the seeds for the moment we find ourselves now in 2021 in the United States, because they went from this laissez-faire attitude that live and let live. If you want a family, you can have one, but you don't really have to have one. Enjoy the benefits of living in urban society, the consumerism, everything is great. And then eventually that erodes away. The left continues to march on into affirmatively opposing all of the good, true, and the beautiful, and upholding the degeneracy that we see in modern life today. What's going on in Loudoun County and what's going on in China are the same phenomenon, just on different clocks. And you'll see that China is taking a much more serious approach to these questions than the United States is, because they can see what's going to happen in their country if they don't handle some of the crises that they're facing right now, whether it's the rampant consumerism, whether it's the fact that people aren't getting married and having children, whether it's urbanization, whether it's income inequality. These are all problems that in some ways China's further along, in some ways the United States is further along, but both come from the same root, which is the liberalism that exists in both parties in the United States, frankly, and is the dominant worldview of globalists the world over.
It is because you see this idea that liberalism means that you yourself as an atomized individual are completely free of any kind of responsibilities, that, getting married and having kids and doing well for yourself in society, that those are all just undue burdens, that those are all oppressions, that you need to release yourself of those. But then it's funny that those same people then find themselves actually in new fetters and new chains, but chains of vices, of, sleeping around and using drugs and procrastinating and being lazy. I mean, that's supposed to be seen as somehow you're now free. You're yourself an individual, and yet you're finding yourself in new chains, unfortunately. And I think it's interesting seeing how China is reacting to the U.S., because in many ways they try and stoke a lot of the racial animosity here and all of our other social ills, transgenderism, LGBTQ indoctrination, and so on and so forth, while they take the opposite course. And so we've seen in China that they're trying to get rid of what they call sissy boys or girly boys from TV and media. Also, we're seeing them getting rid of, or limiting at least, I should say, the amount of time that kids are allowed to be playing video games. Of course, these are all very authoritarian ways of going about it, but we see the root of what they're trying to do. They even got rid of their one-child policy. Now they're actually encouraging people to have more kids because they're seeing a falling birth rate as well. They're not being able to replace themselves. But the way they're going about it, though, I think is just as damaging, because really what I think is that they need God. And the West, we need God too. So it doesn't matter if they want to go about it a different way to try and get the end result. I mean, if you don't have God, you're not going to get the correct outcomes, do you think?
I entirely agree with that. And that's where I think the Chinese approach is ultimately going to fail, is that they don't have the influence of Christian civilization and the Christian heritage for how to solve these problems. We can look back over the last 400, 500, 600 years to pre-modern societies, to very recent ones. In fact, even the early American Republic, where Christianity and faith were placed central to the task of governance. You look at a lot of the individual colonies before we became the Union, that they had state religions. There was basically a state religion in each of the 13 colonies, with rare exception. That influence of Christian governance and Christian values that were influencing the founding at the time is what created the thriving, high trust, well-functioning society with things like markets and prosperity that we so love. But unfortunately, modern conservatives and modern liberals alike assume that you can have one without the other. They can say, we can take a live and let live approach to faith, we can take a live and let live approach to family, we can take a live and let live approach to culture, and everything will be fine. Meanwhile, they're just freeloading on the fumes of fuel that our ancestors put into society, rooted in these traditional Christian values. And unfortunately, we're starting to run out of it. And it's going to be a very dark day in America indeed when we finally draw down on those final drops of the prosperity that can come from a really well-integrated society where faith is placed central instead of something like GDP growth or licentiousness or liberty without any context.
And I think that's exactly right, because I think this is a very pivotal moment, at least here in America. We're seeing, I mean, despite A.G. Garland and Biden's Department of Injustice and everything trying to go after parents as domestic terrorists potentially and guilty of hate crimes, I mean, a lot of parents now are standing up and they're starting to see some good progress. However, I think right now that parents, instead of wanting to turn back the clock and say, oh, remember 10, 15, 20 years ago when schools were, maybe better, they weren't teaching LGBTQ indoctrination and pedophilic sex ed and racial indoctrination, CRT and everything else. But I think that actually back then as well, when it was more of the secular ideas, that's an ideology in it of itself. And that's actually the framework that I think that allowed this wokeification that we've seen increase exponentially over the past decade. And so I think really what we need to bring back is actually, as you were talking about, faith in the classroom. Because no matter what, kids are going to need a framework of reference. Secularism is an ideology itself. We tend to think that that's apolitical and it's a-religious and, everyone's happy, but not really. Yeah, I think it kind of sows the seeds for nihilism. And like I said, it paves the way for everything that we're dealing with today. Because I remember back in school, I learned about Washington and Jefferson and Aristotle and all these greats as well. But I realized I only memorized what I needed to know for the test, and I never knew what they thought in any kind of depth. And there's really so much depth to a lot of these historical figures. So do you think we need to really go back to that and really recapture that in this moment?
Absolutely. And you've got this point exactly right, which is that secularism or the absence of some sort of value system in the classroom will only last for but a moment. Something will come in to fill the gap. We are fundamentally religious creatures as human beings. And so we have a choice. We can either use the true religions that the West has had undergird it for thousands of years, or we can allow for left-wing religion, which is wokeness, critical race theory, all this stuff to infect instead. And it's really important to be vigilant about this point. This did not begin just a couple of years ago. This is part of what concerns me about the fight against critical race theory. Look, I want to get critical race theory out of our schools, but I would hate for all of this energy, all of this drive by parents to fix their children's schools to think that 2013 was somehow the halcyon days and everything was great and fine and dandy then. No, the problems root much earlier, because guess what? If you have schools where faith is not taught, where these true values are not taught, the kids that will come out of them will then raise children who are much more affirmatively left-wing because they had no value system in which to root people. And so it's really critical to realize is that the 90s weren't some utopia, the early 2000s weren't some utopia, and the dystopia we're starting to see now in the United States has its roots in choices that we made long before that, and choices that hopefully we can start to turn back on.
And Loudoun County, of course, has been in many ways ground zero for a lot of this, of parents really pushing and fighting back against what we're seeing right now. However, what concerns me, though, is the way a lot of conservatives go about what we're seeing. As you're talking about, a lot of the way we combat the left is just debunking them. It's just, oh, the media lies to you, so then here's why what the media headlines say isn't true. However, I think that kind of misses the point, because as we're talking about here in Loudoun, I mean, what you're dealing with is an entire school board, and of course, you got top prosecutors and a lot of other powerful people who know that there were charges against this gender fluid student, and not just any kind of charges, but forcible sodomy. We're talking actual rape. So this is very serious charges, and yet they were covering up for their greater political needs at the time. So they're happy with a 15-year-old girl getting raped in the bathroom and covering up for that. And they're just as happy to get her father arrested for making a stink about it in school. So those are the kind of people that we're dealing with in the left. You can't just go to these leftists and say, oh, did you know that actually you're wrong, that there are charges against this kid, or rape really did happen. And so that's going to change their mind, because a lot of them, they did know that and they still didn't care. Does that kind of change the game and how us as conservatives really should be meeting this moment?
Exactly. And this is what frustrates me so much about conservatives is that they're embarrassed by their own side. And so when a story like this breaks, you can count on one hand the amount of conservatives that are willing to stand up for the sort of person that represents their base. This is a white working class man with children. There are no greater Republicans or conservatives anywhere in the country. And the idea of defending someone like that, someone who's standing up for all the values that, think tanks in Washington love to drone on about, is anathema to most conservatives in DC because they're embarrassed. Oh, this person's a rube. Maybe they said something naughty on the internet. Maybe they're not going about this the exact right way. They didn't quote Aristotle enough in their testimony in front of the Loudoun County School Board. Meanwhile, the left takes a ruthless approach to defending their people. Remember, Kamala Harris posted links for bail funds for people who set American cities on fire last year. That is what the leading echelons of the left are willing to do in order to defend their people. And so where do conservatives default to? Because they're not willing to actually defend their voters. Instead, they just like to take pot shots at a group they're slightly more embarrassed by, which is the left. They got this fact slightly wrong. Oh, aren't these wacky libs doing this wild stuff? Instead, they're not willing to reckon with the reality that you can criticize one side all you want, but unless you're willing to be an affirmative champion for your own people, ultimately, the left is going to continue to extract resources and dignity and decency from the middle of this country, and Republicans are asleep at the wheel as they do so.
That's exactly right. We need to be able to feel confident in using the powers that we do have when we have some of our elected officials who do make it into office. And then we see that they get, we really can't, outlaw this. And then that would just be big government. And of course, that's the kind of, way that they govern, talking about certain states and certain governors, cough, cough, South Dakota and elsewhere. We've seen them, you vote them into office and all of a sudden transgender issues come up or anything else, vaccine mandates. And they go, well, I really can't get involved. That's just big government. And then here us Republicans are saying, fight for us. We put you in office to fight for us. Don't turn your backs on us now. So hopefully everything that we're dealing with now will maybe light a fire under a lot of elected Republican officials, that us voters, that things are getting really, really dangerous. We're really hitting a tipping point, if you will, in this culture. And so it really necessitates us actually fighting and standing up. So Saurabh, I know you're a great leader in that regard. Thanks so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you for having me on, Kara.